It's time for Hall of Fame broadcaster Al Bernstein to interact with some of the most fascinating big name guests from the world of boxing and well beyond. Here's Al.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the show. On this edition, as my special guest, we'll have Chris Mannix, who, of course, has been a terrific writer at Sports Illustrated and is a fine broadcaster with his own podcast and doing the boxing on DAZN, the platform that does so much terrific boxing these days. And I got a chance to talk to Chris about basketball, about boxing, about broadcasting. And here's my chat with Chris Mannix. Chris, thanks so much for taking the time to visit with me. You are a multifaceted guy who I'm anxious to talk about several topics with. Everybody knows, of course, about your great work with the NBA as well as boxing. My two favorite sports, by the way. So I'm like you. I'm more than interested in both of them. And just for full disclosure, we're having this conversation just before the NBA Finals is going to end. So we cannot tell you exactly who won it, but we can talk in general about it. In fact, that's the very first thing I wanted to ask you about. In covering the NBA so often, there is not a variation in who plays for the championships, who plays in the Final Four, if you will. We had four teams this year that were very new to, in recent years, to playing for a championship. Is that overall beneficial to the league? It seems to me like it would be.
Yeah, I think the NBA, and I've had several conversations with Adam Silver about this over the years. They crave that NFL style parity. They want, 10 teams to enter the playoffs believing they have a legitimate chance to win a championship. And really, in the last 2 decades, the NBA has been defined by super teams, whether it was the Lakers in the early aughts, you fast forward to Miami, Golden State, Cleveland kind of was one, at least when it came to the Eastern Conference. Those are still going to exist. I mean, Brooklyn's got one that could emerge very rapidly beginning next season. But the NBA loves this, and even though the ratings are down from a couple of years ago, because look, fans like super teams. They watch either to watch them win or to root against them to lose. Even though the ratings are down, the NBA will take that trade-off. They want to hopefully establish something where teams like Phoenix and Milwaukee are competing for a championship every single year. In other words, if it's Utah against Brooklyn next year, I think the NBA would be ecstatic.
Yeah, so they're playing the long game as opposed to the short game.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. You in your covering of the NBA, which you've done for a long time for Sports Illustrated, you've seen differences in the play, the way teams play on the court and the way they handle things off the court. On the court, what is the biggest change you've seen during this time when you've covered since for at least 17, 18 years, the NBA? What's the biggest change you've seen on the court in the style of play?
I mean, offensive explosion is the easy answer. I mean, that goes back to the late 1990s when the NBA took, literal measures to legislate out the physicality from the game. That gave birth to more high scoring games. And, really in the last 10, 15 years, with the emergence of the likes of Steph Curry and Trae Young, who is a byproduct of Steph Curry, like you're seeing this new generation
That's true.
of 3-point shooters that just bomb away from anywhere on the court at any time during the game. I mean, that's the biggest shift, where just 3-point shooting, NBA coaches will tell you they like 3 shots in games: a 3-pointer, a layup, or a free throw. Like the mid-range game that people grew up watching Michael Jordan use, and even a younger generation watching Kobe Bryant use at a high level. It's not in the game anymore, and that's because coaches don't want it in the game anymore. They don't see the mid-range jumper as a high percentage shot. They'll take a lightly contested 3 over an open 2 probably every single day.
we have this discussion. You know, it's like like I have friends that we get together every Tuesday night at one of the bars here. Most of them are musicians and music people that I do my music performances with, but they're super sports fans. And we talk about sports and the changing nature. Baseball always gets a large portion of the discussion, but the NBA is in there also for the very things that you talked about, that when people run down on a fast break, the two people on the wing, and of course we were all taught to play this way, weren't we? You go to the basket, but that is nothing like what happens now. Both, or if you have a three-man fast break, one or both of those men that don't have the ball are going to go to the three-point line.
Yeah, they'll space. I mean, that's just the way the game is played. And, you know, it's being taught that way at an AAU level now. It's being taught that way or played that way at a college level. And the second you get into the NBA, you know, you talk about changes. I mean, three-point shooting amongst big men is another big change.
Amazing,
I mean,
yes.
You know, you watch these NBA finals and you see Brook Lopez, you know, shooting like 3 or 4 3-pointers every single game. Brook Lopez, early in his career, barely shot threes. He recognized the terrain that you have to be a three-point shooter at 5 positions now, and he adapted. He learned. Marc Gasol is another great example of it. Someone that didn't shoot threes early in his career and just developed it. Nowadays, it's few and far between the number of big men that are just complete non-threats from the three-point line. And if you are, you better be like a Rudy Gobert, where you have other attributes that make you invaluable to be on the floor.
Yeah, it's fascinating. That's always changing. Well, one sport that changes some, but I think it's probably the one sport where people say it changes the least is the sport of boxing, one that you are very, very involved with. First, a question to you as a broadcaster. You have done more television boxing in recent years than you ever did before. Is it as you expected it to be, being involved in boxing broadcasts, or is there some facet of it that is surprising to you?
Oh, doing the job that you've done for many years, that I watched all the time, that Max Kellerman did for many years. I've done a lot of interviewing, right? Like I've worked for a lot of networks, whether it's NBC, Epix, you know, a lot of networks that hired me to be an interviewer. This job with the Zone is the first time they've given me an opportunity to call fights, and that is remarkably challenging because, you know, it's good, and you work with Abner and you work with Paulie before, so working with boxers makes it a little bit easier because you don't have to try to analyze kind of every punch or every movement. I let, in this case, Sergio Mora do that for me. And, you know, trying to add context is really I view as my sole responsibility. And it's definitely challenging. It's a lot different than just sitting there ringside and preparing questions for a post-fight interview than, you know, sitting there and trying to come up with something smart to say in those moments in between the action. It does lend itself to some incredibly bonehead moments. I mean, we've all had them, right? Like I had mine.
It's live TV.
I did. Like I'll tell you that, and I've said this before, but like the Anthony Joshua, Andy Ruiz fight, like I went into it thinking Anthony Joshua was absolutely going to knock Andy Ruiz out. And I spent like a couple of days thinking about what would my line be if Anthony Joshua knocks down Andy Ruiz. And sure enough, in the third round, he knocks him down. I spit out, Anthony Joshua is a composed and ferocious finisher. Watch this. And sure enough, Andy Ruiz turns around and knocks Andy Ruiz down. I was forced to eat that quote out for I'm still eating that quote. I mean, it was funny. I actually used it again for Joshua against Pulev. I said, Brian Kenny was working the broadcast with me. And I said, you know, Joshua knocked down Pulev. And I go, let's try this again, Brian. Anthony Joshua is a composed and ferocious finisher. Unfortunately, he did finish that fight.
Those lines hang on your neck like an albatross. You know, it's funny you're saying that. I spent the first 25 years of my career as being part of two-man booths, where I was doing the sole analyst, and then three-man booths with a boxer became more prevalent, and I was involved in them. And I had to slightly alter my role a little bit from the previous time. And I've often said that finding your spot as a quote unquote third, I'm not going to say third man, but I'm going to say in that role on the broadcast is difficult because you are, what you need to do then is make anecdotal comments and informational comments along with that are not being done by the play-by-play guy, and still make comments about style that are not being done by the boxer or the athlete.
Yeah, and one thing I try to do is just bring reporting to that kind of position. Like, for example, when one of the fights we had recently that I called was Sullivan Barrera against Gilberto Ramirez. And during fight week, I gave Jesse Hart a call. Jesse Hart had fought both those guys very recently, in fact. And I asked him sort of how he saw this fight kind of playing out. And then on the air, I would regurgitate what Jesse Hart told me. So I just try to, I always want to call what I see. And this, like as a reporter, you kind of have instincts to see things. And I tend to see injuries pretty quickly, or if something happens, I've developed kind of a knack for doing that on the fly. But more than anything, I want to be able to say something that isn't necessarily what you're seeing, but what other people aren't able to get anywhere else. Yeah.
You mentioned the fact that, of course, your forte is interviewing, and you do it on your podcast. You've done it on radio. You do it on DAZN. You do it in many different platforms. And some people think boxers are not interesting interviews, and maybe some aren't. But I think boxers are really, many boxers are very interesting people to interview. Do you agree?
I completely agree. Post-fight, I mean, it's wild with post-fight. It's like you interview a guy. It's like you're interviewing a guy that just was in a car crash, and you ask him if he wants to go do it again. Like, it's just like, it's sort of surreal that these guys are not forced, but are put in the position where they have to speak after maybe 12 rounds of a war. But boxers in general, absolutely. I mean, nobody wakes up as a child and says, I want to box. Like, this is not how it works. Like, they are generally either forced into boxing or do it as a pathway to a better life, which lends itself to some unbelievable stories. I mean, you've covered Floyd for a long time. Like, his story is remarkable. Coming out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, all he went through with his father and climbing up the ranks. I mean, most boxers have those stories. Like the Calvin Brocks of the world, the boxing bankers, are few and far between. Like, most of these guys, come from the seventh circle of hell. And in addition, they don't have teammates to protect. So it's like they're willing to give you kind of the unvarnished truth. And if you spend enough time with guys, you'll get a really compelling story. That's why when I criticize boxing and some of the things that go on in it, it's just because I want to see it surge again. I want to see it back into the mainstream. So my bosses at Sports Illustrated will be like, that's an interesting fighter. Let's do 6 pages on him. Because right now, you have to beg and scrap to get anything published in the magazine.
Yeah, looking back at boxing, going all the way back to I always talk about the late 90s as being when boxing started to step into this abyss of media coverage where mainstream sports media just kind of stopped covering the sport and did so for most of the time until, I'm going to say, recently, when it's been a little bit better. And part of that is because boxing came back on over-the-air networks, and there were other platforms like DAZN and other places for it. But yeah, trying to pitch a boxing story is not always the easiest thing to.
It's funny, Al. Like, I had this conversation recently with Jerry Eisenberg, who you both know well.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And I was talking to Jerry about kind of what press row looked like, in his early days, and he's describing all these luminaries, these great writers that were covering these like heavyweight title fights, and that continued in the 70s and 80s and into the 1990s. I'm glad for the people that are employed in the boxing space. There are some excellent boxing journalists out there: Keith Idek, Mike Coppinger, Lance Pugmire, great guys that are doing it. But you just don't. These are more off, in some cases, boxing specific sites, which is great for the boxing fan to see coverage saturated like that. But to draw in new fans, whether you like mainstream media or not, you need the New York Times, the Washington Post, Sports Illustrated to be invested in bringing you these stories to start telling some of their tales.
Yeah, and it's incumbent on the mainstream sports media, I think, of course, listen, people have presupposed ideas about boxing, and I think it's important for the mainstream sports media to, understand boxing's failings, and but also understand the nature of the sport that makes it kind of special. And your point's well taken. Some of the reason to point out the failings of the sport is for it to be maybe end up being better. You have done a lot of work with Canelo in recent time.
I should point out that for a while, Al, Canelo, I think it was like the entire first year, Canelo was calling me Max. So, it was like, I wasn't sure at first if he was saying Mannix, because, you can make that mistake, but there was at least once that I heard him say, "Thank you, Max." Like, and now we've been doing it so long together, like 4 or 5 fights.
Now he knows you're Mannix.
Yeah,
instead of Max.
he knows I'm Chris now. Like, I mean, he's been very,
Chris.
very good to
Okay.
me. But I like that. I think it was the very first fight. It was Kovalev, actually. It was his second fight or something like that. That he was. That I got a Max during some kind of interview that I did with him.
That is. I see that as progress, though. That you have your own identity. He's become, obviously he's become the face of boxing to a great degree, and I've done a lot of fights of Canelo as well, and he's a fascinating guy because he began the sport early, has had 3 or 4 different phases in the sport. So you can't say this is the definitive Canelo or that's the definitive Canelo. He's been a living organism and a changing organism through his whole career.
Yeah, and you're still seeing improvements, even at now 31 years old. It's remarkable. I mean, sometimes when you have a fighter that, even you go back to 2013, 14, when he was fighting Mayweather and Austin Trout and Erislandy Lara, like if he had just stayed that fighter, he'd probably be really successful. I mean, he'd have a strong career, but the evolution of him, specifically defensively. I mean, you were calling a lot of those early fights that he was in. I don't think he was the same defensive guy in the early days that he turned into in recent years. Head movement, just in and out. He's just so difficult to hit clean, even when you do hit him clean. I mean, I saw Golovkin do it when I was watching his fights, and I saw Daniel Jacobs do it once against Canelo. You hit him, he rolls with these punches really well. So even if it looks like on TV he's getting tagged, you watch the replay and he's rolling with that punch. So it's not the kind of impact that the opponent is really looking for. I mean, maybe it's the influence of Eddie Reynoso, maybe it's just a natural progression for a supremely talented guy, but his growth defensively has been really remarkable the last 5 years.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's probably the most significant. And when you attach to that the fact that he has a rock solid chin and doesn't seem able to be hurt,
which is, by the way, shocking. Like, Al, I was there for Jose Miguel Cotto when he buckled him, was it 10, 11 years ago?
Yeah,
his first fight in the U.S.
Right.
And I remember thinking, like, all right, well, maybe this is another kind of golden boy thing where they signed a really popular guy that looks good, but he's not going to be an elite level fighter. I had my doubts after that Jose Miguel Cotto fight for sure.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and he did turn into this, and now we're all awaiting what his next move is. And boxing seems to turn, not all of boxing, but certainly that a couple of weight divisions turn on what Canelo ends up wanting to do. Your opinion, I'll just let you go with this. Your opinion on what's the most fun for Canelo in the near future that you see?
Well, it sounds like Caleb Plant's the guy. And there have been some reports on Tuesday that there was a deal inching towards the finish line, which makes sense. It's the fight that Canelo publicly stated he absolutely wanted after beating Billy Joe Saunders. Whatever we think about the belts, it's an achievement to become the undisputed champion in a 4-belt era. So it sounds like that's what we're barreling towards. No problem with that fight. You've watched a lot of Plant as well. I don't know what you think, but I don't give him much of a chance. Like, excuse me, it's really hard to go from C and D level opponents who Caleb Plant has been facing, Mike Lee, Vincent Feigenboots, and Caleb Truax, to go to Canelo. Like, you just can't do it. Even, Billy Joe Saunders had some decent wins on his resume, but nothing on the Canelo level. And you could see the difference there when the going got tough in those later rounds. So, I mean, all credit to Plant. He's got the title and he's world champion, but that's a fight I would put a lot of money on Canelo to ultimately win. The fight I'm still most interested in now is the third fight with Golovkin. And people kind of roll their eyes at that sometimes. Be like, well, it's over with. Golovkin's almost 40, yada, yada, yada. Fine. I get that. But we have not seen a definitive outcome in this fight.
No, true.
The first fight was, Golovkin. Golovkin should have won that fight. Forget the Adelaide Bird scorecard. There was that other scorecard that had the 7th round scored for Canelo, but it should have gone Golovkin. He should have gotten the win in that fight. I had no problem with the decision in the second fight. I had Golovkin winning 115-113, but if you go the other way, no issue whatsoever. That was a very tough fight to score. But, there's been no clear-cut winner here. So maybe Canelo goes out and beats up on the older fighter. I can see that. Golovkin hasn't looked great in recent fights, specifically against Sergey Derevyanchenko last year. But that is still, to me, a compelling fight. And when you're trying to attract kind of a mainstream audience, Al, we're in the weeds on this, and we know, Golovkin's a little bit older, and we know the Canelo would be a heavy favorite. But the average fan doesn't. The average fan's like, oh, Canelo Triple G, Canelo Triple G, Canelo Triple G. I saw the first 2 fights. Let's see the third. So I'm all for him having the biggest fights out there, and Plant is a huge fight because of the belt. But the most marketable fight still for him is a third fight with Gennady Golovkin. Interesting.
Well, we'll see if that happens. I know, and perhaps you'll be on hand there to offer your expertise and do some interviews surrounding it and all the rest, as you do expertly. And Chris, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit. And folks need to check out every platform that they can find you on, and they are many and varied, as I mentioned at the beginning of this.
Hopefully next time we talk, Al, it'll be before Castaño Charlo 2, because I'm ready.
Yeah, we would. Speaking of undisputed titles, yes, we would like to. We didn't quite get to an undisputed title. A very close fight, one scorecard that came from the planet Mercury, as often is the case in boxing, but a very, well, let me ask you, since you're making it up before I let you go, did you think that was a close fight, Charlo and Castaño? I haven't revisited again. I leaned toward Castaño maybe to win. I didn't score every round, but I didn't think it was a blowout either way.
No, I don't think it was a blowout. I was kind of dual watching. They had Game 5 of the finals on Saturday, so I was kind of had both things going at once. I went back and rewatched it afterwards. And I had 16-12 for Castaño, and I didn't think it was any closer than that. It wasn't a blowout for sure, but 16-12 Castaño felt about right, especially since I thought he really controlled most of the first half of the fight, except for that second round. I mean, look, boxing judging is such a complicated conversation because there is no governing body. Every state does things differently.
Exactly.
It's so obnoxious. But can we all get on the same page where you and I can both name the top 4 judges in boxing? Every promoter I talk to lists the same names. It's like, it's Weisfeld, who was on that card in Texas. It's Dave Moretti in Nevada. It's Glenn Feldman in Connecticut. You can throw Julie Letterman in New York. People know who the top judges are. Why don't these states just use them? Let's start with the big fights, the marquee fights. Right. And let's solve that judging problem before we have to go down to these undercard fights that might be getting problematic because there are bad judges on them. I mean, that was a tremendous fight. I loved that fight from start to finish. I was gripped at the very end to see if Charlo could muster something to knock him out, especially when you got Derek James in his corner saying over and over again, like, you need a knockout to go and win. I was captivated by it. But what did I talk about on my DAZN show on Tuesday? Nelson Vasquez and the judging issue in boxing. We don't need judges overshadowing big fights, Al. Boxing has enough problems as it is.
No, I agree. That adds to that makes it a bigger issue. Well, hopefully they'll do it again, and we'll get what we think is a definitive decision on it. Hey, Chris, thanks so much for visiting with me. Best of luck.
Anytime, Al.
So, Chris Mannix, a man who has made the transition from the printed word or the digital word, as it would be, to broadcasting in many respects, both in the podcasting and streaming and television platforms. And it was fun to get a chance to chat with him about the affairs of the day in boxing and basketball and other stuff as well. And you get to ask me questions on this show at Al Bernstein on Twitter. And the man that will help me answer all those questions, my co-host, Trip Mitchell. Hi, Trip. How are you?
I'm good, Al. And when you made the transition from being a writer to a broadcaster, it was pretty abrupt. They didn't send you away to TV commentating school, did they?
No, I'd done a little bit of broadcast work in Chicago, but not that much. And I found myself, now granted, back in those days it was an embryonic network, but I was on the ESPN fights all of a sudden, the kind of city, got in there just to pinch hit kind of, and it worked. But yeah, I didn't have a long transition time for sure. So, but most of the skills that you learn as a writer help you in broadcasting.
Was it? Did you immediately know on your first fight this would be something I'd really like to do?
Yeah, I could tell immediately. If I knew that if I could keep doing this, it would be really great, and luckily I was able to.
And another fellow Chicagoan, Brent Musburger, went from print to work with CBS, and now he's in Vegas doing his thing. Did you get to know him, and was that?
Yeah, I
fun
didn't really
being a
know
Chicago
Brett
guy?
that well, actually, in Chicago, but I knew people that knew him when he was a newspaper guy, and he's a little older than me, so he was like a half a generation ahead of me. But he was a very well-liked newspaper guy in Chicago, and then he got to do the sports news in Chicago, and that's what pushed him to the network.
Fantastic. Well, let's get to our questions. And the first one's a great one. Darren O'Hare writes, who are your top 3 greatest defensive boxers in the history of the sport?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, a couple of these names I think would be on anybody's list. Willie Pep, of course, the great featherweight from days gone by, who is rumored to have won a round without ever throwing a punch. I don't know how that's possible, but they say it is true. It's plausibly true, I guess, that he made the guy miss so much that nobody noticed that he didn't land a punch. But he was, of course, a brilliant defensive fighter. And then Pranaelle Whitaker, who I did some of his fights in the 80s, was just amazing. There was a fight against Santos Cardona that he fought on ESPN that and Santos Cardona was a really solid offensive fighter who was a good top solid contender. And I mean, I think Santos Cardona landed maybe 10% of his punches, a ridiculously low amount. And Pranaelle Whitaker just made him miss everything. Pranaelle Whitaker, a brilliant defensive fighter. And the third one is Floyd Mayweather, who has showed over his long career that he was a defensive wizard. A few guys had decent offensive nights against him, but none great. And so he'd be my third pick.
Okay. And our second question, your thoughts on the Crawford-Porter fight actually happening, and if it does, how do you see that fight going?
Yeah, I think it probably will happen. It's gone to purse bid, and I have a feeling this is going to be one of those cases where we get a fighter from the top-ranked stable and the Premier Boxing Channel champions stable that fight each other, and I think it's a fascinating fight. Sean Porter performed really well against Errol Spence and did so by being kind of a boxer puncher. He boxed well and also was able to land some power shots pretty effectively as well. Sean Porter is undervalued by most people. He's a very tough customer, even in his mid-30s now. He's really, really a good fighter. And, of course, Crawford is heading to his mid-30s as well. Terrence Crawford is fantastic. We don't know about Terrence Crawford, though. Honestly, we don't know how he functions against a really good fighter. And if Sean Porter isn't an A-level fighter, he's an A- level fighter. So we're going to find out a little bit more about Terrence Crawford facing a welterweight who we know, Sean Porter's had a couple losses to Kell Brook and Keith Thurman, very close losses that could have gone his way. But he's been able to compete, and of course the Spence loss, but very close again. All 3 of those fights were winnable for him, and if you gave him the decision on any 3 of those, nobody could argue. So I think it's going to be a very close and competitive fight. I think it's Crawford will go in the favorite for sure, but not by a ton. And I think it's going to be a real intriguing fight, because I think Crawford may be surprised at some of Porter's boxing skills. But make no mistake, Terrence Crawford is a super skilled fighter, and it could be that he is absolutely the best of the lot. It's just that we don't know it yet because we haven't seen him in against some of these top welterweights. But if that fight happens, we will see it, and I think it's going to be fascinating. Well, we appreciate you all sending in your questions to us, and we'll get some more the next time. And I hope you enjoyed the visit we had with Chris Mannix. We want to thank him for visiting with us. My thanks to Trip Mitchell, as always, and the folks at Let's Do Something Productions for making this show possible. We'll see you next time.